Revenge films.
Back when my father was still alive, he was gone overseas most of the time for work, and I spent much of my time living with my mother and older sister. My mother, Karen, loved my sister, Jane, and they treated me like I didn't even exist. Even on my birthdays, my father would send me gifts, but I can't recall a single time that my mother even celebrated for me. Jane learned from my mother and treated me like she did. If I ever received any gifts that she liked, she would take them and use them herself. I never understood why my mother was so cold to me and why Jane was so mean to me. I even talked to my father about it many times and had him scold them for me, but it never lasted more than a few days. Whenever my dad had time off work and was at home, they acted normally around me, which was even more insidious of them. I spent most of my youth being treated cruelly by them. My father made plenty of money, and we should have been fairly rich. But my mother and sister would go on vacations together all the time and overspend his money. I would be left at home. You can survive on this. My mother didn't even leave me any money, and I would have to ration a Modi loaf of bread over a few days. After I graduated, I left the house and started living on my own. Well, I was pretty much kicked out, but I didn't mind. We don't have any money to give to you. My mother didn't help me out at all, but my father secretly transferred some money to me. One such day, my father passed out at work, and he came back to town to be hospitalized. He was diagnosed with cancer. I visited him every day, but my mother would just stop by briefly to drop off some things for him and go home immediately. It was thanks to him that my mother and Jane were able to live so lavishly. So I told Jane many times to go visit him and show her face. He would be happy to see you. Yeah, I will. But those were empty promises. She never showed up, even once. At first, my mother came by a couple times a week, but at the end, I was the only one visiting normally. It was so heartbreaking to watch him get weaker and weaker. I saw a young man visiting him a couple times. He was a young man, still in his 30s. And although I thought it was unusual that my father was friends with such a young guy, I didn't think much about it. Things went on like that for about 6 months, and one day, my father passed over with a peaceful look on his face. A few days later, the lawyer called us up to talk about the inheritance. I was surprised to see that young man that had been visiting my father multiple times. We had met a couple times, so we nodded at each other, but what came out of his mouth was absolutely shocking.
Your father's will states that everything shall be inherited by Emma.
That was all he said. And my mother just exploded. What? Why does this girl get everything? All of that money belongs to me. Jane jumped in as well. Yeah, why does Emma get everything? What about my share and Mom's share? Emma doesn't deserve any of this money anyway. My mother and sister turned my way with fury in their eyes. Just as they were about to jump on the lawyer, he said there was more.
He explains in his will the reasons as well, so please, let me share it with you.
Neither one of them seemed interested at all, but I was very curious why my father left all his inheritance for me. The lawyer started explaining, and I was shocked at every statement. First, he claimed that my mother had been having an affair, and it wasn't something recent. It was a relationship that I had begun before marrying my father, and she took advantage of my father's work situation and had been continuing that relationship for many years. My mother seemed caught off guard, but argued back. That's all false! You can't take away my inheritance based off false rumors! My mother was complaining, and I was just shocked that my mother was being so unfaithful to my father for so many years. Then, the lawyer started explaining why my sister wasn't getting inheritance. Shockingly, Jane wasn't my father's child. She was the child between my mother and her boyfriend. It seemed like Jane already knew this and turned away from me awkwardly. My mother had lied to my father and made him raise Jane as his own daughter. I'll never know when my father found out the truth about everything. The lawyer did more digging, and he found out that my mother and sister had planned as soon as they'd found out about my father's cancer to cut ties with me and live lavishly with my mother's boyfriend as soon as my father passed away. After the lawyer exposed her and she found out that she wasn't receiving any inheritance, my mother went wild. Are you kidding me? Why do you think I waited this long? She got up and started yelling and screaming. Her plans to get that money were ruined, and she was losing her mind. It was shocking enough that my mother was cheating on my father, but it was even more shocking to find out that my mother had already introduced my boyfriend to Jane as her real father. I don't know when it was that Jane found out, but the lawyer had already gathered evidence of the three of them going out together. My father started gathering evidence as soon as he found out about the affair and found out that my mother and sister were overspending his money while he was overseas and while he was sick in the hospital. He also found out how badly I was being treated and decided to leave all the inheritance with me. My lawyer just coldly explained my father's last dying wishes. Needless to say, my mother and Jane were furious. Give us that inheritance, bitch! They tried to jump on me, but my lawyer warned them to stop.
I wouldn't do that if you don't want to get sued.
Those words made them stop in their tracks. The lawyer was a young man, but my father had looked after him while he was alive and had warned him that when the two found out about the inheritance, they would try to hurt me, and he wanted him to protect me using any means necessary. My mother was pulling her hair out. You won't get away with this! She took Jane and stomped out of the office. I felt my father's fighting spirit, even though he wasn't with me anymore. It was his last stand against his cheating wife, and Jane, who knew everything and was spending his money as she wished. It was his way of punishing them from up above. My father's spirit was incredible, but I was also very impressed by the lawyer. He had vigorously worked to grant my father's last dying wishes and had done so much detailed investigation on my mother and sister. I heard from him later that as he investigated and found out more and more about the terrible things that they had been doing, he realized how bad my situation was. And although he isn't supposed to make his work personal, he couldn't forgive them for treating the daughter of his mentor so badly and decided to investigate even more in depth. I just stood there in disbelief when the young lawyer came up to me and told me my father's last words.
Before your father fell ill, he always spoke about how he wanted to gather evidence and divorce your mother and live with you, Emma. He was hoping for a peaceful life.
The thought of my father, who was gone now, and the realization that my father had always had me in his mind hit me all at once, and I started crying.
After that, I successfully finished the paperwork to receive my father's inheritance. Now, without my father's income or the inheritance, my mother's boyfriend left them. Seems like he was in it for the money as well. I received a call from my mother later.
Give me that inheritance. That is for me and Jane.
She still gives me calls like that all the time. But I'm about to cancel this phone, so soon enough, that shouldn't be a problem anymore. I finally understood why my mother always loved Jane and neglected me. She just saw my father as an ATM machine. My mother and sister have gotten so used to a lavish lifestyle, so it does make me curious how they plan to live from now on. I plan to leave the city where they live and start a new life somewhere else. On a side note, that lawyer who granted my father's last wishes and protected me is now my husband. We met a couple times after that to discuss the inheritance process, and he told me all kinds of stories of my father. We got to know each other like that, and eventually, we started dating. I heard later, but my father had left him a message too.
If miracles really do happen, I would hope that someone like you would take in Emma, but that's just wishful thinking.
We granted my father's last wishes together.
How was today's video? If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Stay tuned for more.